All right, let's jump into another deep dive. We are talking The Stolen Child this time. This upcoming fantasy film, and it's already got people buzzing, you know? You send over this article here from MovieWeb about the new trailer, and gosh, just reading it, I'm already excited. It looks like it'll be this really interesting blend of like Celtic mythology with that epic
Mm.
scope you get from, you know, something like The Lord of the Rings. I think one of the things that really caught my eye was that the director, Sebastian MacKinnon, he has this background as an illustrator for Magic the Gathering. So I'm thinking visually this is going to be a real treat.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's interesting you bring that up as
Yeah.
background
Yeah.
because to me that speaks volumes about how ambitious this project is, you
Yeah.
know. The Stolen Child, this isn't McKinnon's first film either. He actually started working on it as a series of short films with his brother, Benjamin. Sadly, Benjamin passed away in 2016, and the article mentions how losing him really changed how the film developed.
It is a very personal story tied into the making of this film. And he even said that his brother's last words to him were to continue to create magic with film. And I think you can feel how seriously he takes that commitment, especially, when he says his goal is to make the best fantasy film since The Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, quite a bold statement to make, isn't it?
Yeah.
But when you consider what he said, it's less about bragging and more about, keeping a promise. We're seeing grief, brotherhood, and this real passion for his art all kind of converging in this project.
Yeah.
And you layer on top of that that The Stolen Child is really steeped in Celtic mythology,
Hmm.
which isn't something you see in film too much. I mean, compared to, say, Tolkien's world.
No.
And it makes you wonder, what kind of magic are we actually going to see on screen?
Okay, let's get into that. So the synopsis tells us about this human kingdom that's on the verge of collapse. After the king and queen die, their son, the heir, he's taken by the fairy queen to the fairy realm. It's almost as if she's protecting him, but it throws everything out of whack between the human and fairy worlds, which of course is where our heroes have to step in. And this is where it gets interesting. Our heroes are the poet, the knight, the horse. Yes, you heard that right, the horse, and a fey princess. They all have to band together to find the prince and set things right again. That is not your typical fellowship.
Yeah, it's definitely not the classic hero story. And the fact that they debuted the film at the European Film Market in Berlin makes me think they're trying to reach a wider audience from the get-go, maybe even an international one. And they aren't holding back on making it grand either. The trailer highlights some stunning visuals, especially with the Scottish Highlands as the backdrop.
The MovieWeb article actually compares them to the visuals in The Green Knight, which makes me incredibly excited. Because if McKinnon can capture that same otherworldly feel, I think we're in for something really special. But with all this talk about magic, what do you think that'll actually look like on screen? What's your take on that?
Well, it's hard to say without seeing the whole thing, but I think we can get some clues from McKinnon's past work,
Mm.
like his stuff in Magic, The Gathering. A lot of the time he has these crazy landscapes and creatures. They blend realism with something totally otherworldly,
Mm.
you know.
Yeah.
I can see how that translates really well to the fairy realm and the Stolen Child. And the article mentions the cinematography specifically. It even calls it breathtaking. So it seems like they're really focusing on giving us a visual experience.
It makes me think about those big sweeping shots in The Lord of the Rings, the ones that really made you feel like you were right there in Middle-earth. Do you think we'll get a similar sense of scale and scope in The Stolen Child? I mean, McKinnon wants to make the best fantasy film since The Lord of the Rings, right? And those visuals were a huge part of what made those movies so successful.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say that's what he's going for. And remember, we're dealing with two different worlds here. The human kingdom and the fairy realm. They'll each need their own visual style, their own unique feel. For the human world, maybe we'll see something like the realism in The Green Knight, emphasizing how hard things are for them. But the fairy realm, that's where McKinnon can really let loose.
Right. I'm picturing those glowing forests from Magic, The Gathering, maybe even some creatures that are unlike anything we've seen before in fantasy, not just the typical stuff. There's even a part in the trailer where the Fey Princess seems to be controlling light itself. That's definitely not something you see every day.
No, it's not. It hints at this visual inventiveness that could really make this film stand out. Speaking of The Green Knight, there are some clear similarities in the cinematography. Both films seem to be going for a more grounded, almost natural take on fantasy. Think about how The Green Knight used natural lighting and those earthy colors to create its atmosphere. I wouldn't be surprised if we see the same thing in The Stolen Child, especially with those dramatic Scottish Highlands in the background.
Yeah, and it's not just about making it look pretty. It's about using the visuals to tell the story, to get us invested in it. Every shot in The Green Knight had this feeling of dread, like something bad was coming. Do you think The Stolen Child will go down a similar path, or will it be different, especially with that personal story behind it?
That's the big question, isn't it? On the one hand, you have the potential for these grand, visually impressive scenes that transport us to another world. But on the other hand, there's this underlying feeling of grief and loss, and this promise that needs to be kept. I wonder how McKinnon will bring those two things together.
So we have this quest to restore balance between the human and fairy realms. But maybe there's another quest happening within the director himself, like a quest to find meaning, to keep his brother's memory alive through his art. That could add this whole other level of emotional depth to the film, something that goes beyond the typical fantasy stuff.
It's almost like the act of creating the film becomes a way for him to heal, to find balance after losing someone. And who knows, maybe that's the kind of magic McKinnon is trying to show us. Not just spells and fantastical creatures, but the magic of the human spirit and how stories can stay with us.
That's a really nice thought. It makes you think that maybe the stolen child in the title isn't just the prince, but also a symbol for something lost and the journey to get it back. But let's take a step back for a minute and look at the whole picture. We've talked about how the film could have stunning visuals, a unique take on mythology, and this really personal story at its heart. But what about the challenges? Every ambitious project runs into problems, and The Stolen Child is no exception. What potential issues do you see? I mean, right off the bat, the comparisons to The Lord of the Rings, they're flattering, but they also set the bar really high. We're talking about a trilogy that basically reinvented the fantasy genre. That's a tough act to follow.
Yeah, it is. And there's a chance those comparisons could actually hurt the film.
Yeah.
Like if people think it's just a copycat or it doesn't have that same sense of wonder and scale, that could lead to some disappointed fans.
And you can't forget just how many fantasy stories are out there right now. TV shows, films, streaming series. It feels like everyone wants a piece of that fantasy world. So what do you think The Stolen Child needs to do to really stand out?
I think it needs to have its own strong identity. The Celtic mythology is a great place to start, but they need to dig deeper, explore those little details, the darker side of the myths. And like we said, the visuals have the potential to be amazing.
Mm-hmm.
But they need to be more than just pretty pictures. They need to help tell the story to make us feel something.
Yeah, it's all about finding that balance between spectacle and substance. There are so many fantasy films that rely on CGI and action, but they don't have that emotional core that really connects with people. Do you think McKinnon's personal story, that desire to honor his brother, will that be the key to achieving that balance?
It could be. If they can weave that emotion into the story, so it affects the characters and why they do what they do, it could give the film a depth that a lot of big-budget fantasy movies don't have. But there's also the risk of it being too sappy, Too much about the director and not enough about the characters and the world they live in.
It's a tricky thing to get right, for sure. And then there are the practical challenges, too. Creating a fantasy world on screen, especially one based on Celtic mythology, that takes a lot of attention to detail. The costumes, creatures, the environments, it all adds up.
Yeah, and it can be a logistical nightmare, especially if they're going for that level of realism we saw in The Green Knight. Remember, that film didn't have a huge budget, but they used it well, relying on practical effects and filming on location as much as possible. The Stolen Child might have to do the same thing if they want to avoid that CGI overload that some fantasy films have.
So it seems like we have a film with a ton of potential, but also some big challenges to overcome. A lot depends on McKinnon's ability to bring his vision to life, to balance the spectacular with the personal, and to find a way to stand out in a crowded genre.
It's a risky move, but it could be amazing if they pull it off. And I think that's what makes it so exciting. We're on the verge of something new, something that could be really groundbreaking.
Well, we'll have to wait until 2026 to see the final product. But until then, we can speculate, we can dream, and we can let our imaginations run wild with the possibilities.
And for those of you listening, what's grabbed your attention the most? Is it the Celtic mythology, the potential for those amazing visuals, or maybe the emotional weight of the director's personal story? Whatever it is, let this deep dive be a starting point for you to explore. Dive into Celtic folklore, revisit your favorite fantasy films, and get ready to experience The Stolen Child when it finally hits theaters.